In today's video we're going to be discussing the best methods of dealing with the Drukhari force using our beloved Necrons. Hello, welcome to Planet 40k. So we did a poll a few weeks back and the Drukhari won the poll with 50% of the votes. So that's what we're going to be looking at today. Before we do, today's shout out goes to Mega Matterman for their comment regarding some Necron improvements. So for this video it's going to be more about the Drukhari side of things. As you'll see when we get stuck into the codex, it's got hundreds of combinations and buffs coming from almost everywhere. Countering every single option is just not realistic. However, at the later half of the video, I will try to put some more generic counters for using our Necrons. There will be a timestamp in the video below if you wish to skip ahead to the more generic counters, but it's probably more advisable to actually know what you're countering first. So that's why you're here, right? So the Drukhari, previously known as Dark Eldar, these guys move fast. They tend to make a lot of use with their transports as they're pretty cheap. Their troops are also very cheap and they hit very hard. There's a bazillion combos within the codex. It makes it a fairly complex book, especially for beginners, but a full-fledged Drukhari player will know every trick there is to know. So to start us off, the faction as a whole has a main ability which is the powers from pain. So every battle round, each unit within the force gains a bonus, and these bonuses stack each round, so they're never going to lose those bonuses. So we'll quickly run through these here. So battle round 1, everyone's going to get a 6+ invulnerable save. Battle round 2, they can advance and then charge. Battle round 3, melee attacks will add 1 to the attack's hit rolls. And for the vehicles and monsters, they don't suffer any penalties for firing heavy weapons into engagement range. Battle round 4 improves your invulnerable save to a 5+, and then battle round 5, you automatically pass morale tests. So that battle round 1 getting that 6+ invulnerable save is pretty much as good as the Nefric Dynasty can go. Just a word of warning that within the codex there are rules and abilities which allow a unit to move up the table earlier than planned. So for example, in battle round 1 could be having the effects that they should be getting from battle round 2. So what this could mean is they can get a first round charge after advancing. Also worth a little mention here that they've got a stratagem called the Pain Siphon. It's 1 command point. When a Drukhari unit in the army is within 6 inches of a friendly Kronos unit that destroys a unit, then until the end of the battle, that Drukhari unit will always treat the battle round as if it's battle round 5 for the purposes of the power from pain ability. So they're basically going to have everything in that table when they use this stratagem. So this already looks better than some of our Necron stuff. And guess what guys, you don't need to be within 6 inches of a noble character to get all this stuff, so it's pretty good for them. So on to some more specific abilities that we'll mention here, quite common within the Drukhari Codex. So the first one is the poison weapon ability. A lot of their weapons basically will wound on a 4+ or a 2+, it's regardless of what strength it is. Now it doesn't work on vehicle or titanic units, so it's pretty strong because like I mentioned, the strength of most of their weapons is pretty low, sometimes strength 2, sometimes strength 3, but it literally doesn't matter. Then further that, they've got a stratagem which is 2 command points called Potent Metal Toxins, which is 2 command points, and you can effectively use those poison weapons on vehicle units, although it still does exclude titanic units. But wounding our vehicles on 4s with a buttload of attacks could be pretty bad for us. They've then got Blade Artists, which is each model in the unit that makes an attack with a melee weapon. On an unmodified wound roll of a 6, you're going to improve the AP by 1. So most units have this one, so be aware of that. So that's a bit of a skim version of the faction abilities and an overview of what they're about. So the faction is actually split into 3, which is very similar to the Dark Angel supplement actually. Then on top of that they've got the Blades for Hire, which are not affiliated to any of those 3 sub-factions, kind of like Dynastic Agents, and they don't also gain the faction bonuses. Although there are ways of giving them those bonuses, so be aware of that as well. So each of the 3 sub-factions has its own mini group of sub-factions too. It's getting confusing, right? I'll try my best to explain. So the first are the Cabals. These are the basic Drukhari. They're very Carb-like warrior heavy. They love to ride in the Venoms and the Raiders, as both of those are open top, so these guys can be inside while still shooting and being protected within the transport. So this is more geared towards a shooty playstyle. The Archon is the leader of the Cabal and he's got a gross 2+ invulnerable save, which thankfully cannot be re-rolled, but it's still pretty gross. He can have a pretty menacing warlord trait which allows him to fight first with Ancient Evil. Now the sub-faction has got plenty of tricks that will really hurt our Necron player. Now I wanted to go into a hint of detail regarding one of the Cabal faction selections, as it's probably the most commonly used when you're selecting Cabal, which is the Cabal of the Black Heart. So all the units from that Cabal detachment gain the Black Heart keyword and the faction ability, otherwise known as an obsession, which is thirst for power. So these guys get to advance and charge right from turn 1, as well as having a 6+ invuln save shown in the powers from pain table. Not only that, units using this obsession can also reroll a single hit roll and a single room roll when they're shooting or fighting. And here's another little kick in the teeth. They've got access to a stratagem and it's free. It's called Agents of Vect. It's specifically for the Cabal of the Black Heart attachment, so when your opponent uses a stratagem, excluding command rerolls, until the end of the battle, the CP cost that your opponent must pay for that specific stratagem will now be increased by 1. They can only use this stratagem once, but if you are spamming a certain stratagem such as the extra Catan power stratagem, which is dimensional destabilization, then it's going to be more expensive to do so throughout the entire game. Then to mention one other Cabal option, if they select Cabal of the Poison Tongue, they've got access to Insidious Misdirection stratagem, which has 2 command points, effectively get to select 3 units from the army and redeploy them or put them into strategic reserves, and it's not going to cost them any CP, so it's a little bit like Grand Illusion with our Deceiver Catan shard. So the second mini faction here is the Witch Cults. They like to get close and personal. They're the melee side of the faction. They either hunt in packs of 20 or smaller units that can fit into the transports. Now they've got a unique ability to the Witch Cults which is called Combat Drugs. So from the table here they either get to select one of these or at random they can have 2 of them. And all of them, as you can see, are pretty good. They can be getting an additional attack, an additional strength, a bit of movement, a bit of toughness, an extra bit of weapon skill or an extra bit of ballistic skill, so they're all pretty good. I mean, if it was me, I'd personally just go for the random choice just to get 2 of them. But they've also got a stratagem that you need to watch out for, which is Hyperstim Backlash. It's 2 command points, used on a Witch Cult unit that's using the Combat Drugs ability. Until the next command phase, each effect from the Combat Drugs is going to be doubled. So the example they've given us here is if they're using number 4, which is the Painbringer, which adds 1 to the toughness characteristic, until the next command phase that's going to effectively add 2 to your toughness instead of 1. So this can be a huge multiplier, especially if they took 2 random drugs rather than selecting 1. Now the Succubus is the main leader of the Witch Cults, and she's got her own tricks such as no escape. If we try to fall back from this model, then we roll off, and basically if she wins, we're not falling back, regardless of how much you've spent on a Royal Warden. Another trick up her sleeve, if she's upgraded to a Master Succubus, then she can take the Show Stealer, which allows her to have a 6-inch consolidation move, and it doesn't have to be done to the nearest enemy units. It can go anywhere in any direction and a flat 6 inches. So the main troops are the witches with this cult, and they've got a trick to effectively gain deep strike without actually having deep strike. So they can be placed into a transport, and using the streaming jet stratagem, which is 1 command point, that vehicle will be gaining deep strike. However, that's not all. They can further take the cake because they can use the murderous descent stratagem, which is 1 command point. So used when a transport unit has been set up on the battlefield, any units embarked on the transport can simply disembark as long as they're more than 9 inches away from enemy models, thus giving this troop unit deep strike, and now they're 9 inches away from our Necron models. Reavers are also commonly used here for this cult. They've got an outrageous speed of 18 inches and an auto 8-inch advance. And remember the combat drugs, they can advance and charge in the same turn from battle round 2. They've also got access to the following stratagem due to them having the fly keyword, and this one is disgusting. So the eviscerating flyby, it's 1 command point, or it could be 2 depending on the unit size. In the movement phase, when a Witch Cult unit that can fly goes over an enemy model, you roll a d6 for each model within the unit, adding 1 to the result if the enemy unit is an infantry unit, and on a 5+, the enemy unit suffers 1 mortal wound. Now there's no cap on this like we have with our stratagems, you can just simply do as many as you do. So this is disgustingly overpowered. Now just imagine this flying over a 20-man warrior blob, and because they're an infantry, each 4+ will do a mortal wound. So on average that's 10 mortal wounds right there, and there's no reanimation protocols because this is not a shooting attack and it's not a melee attack, so be warned. So the most commonly used mini faction for the Witch Cults is the Cult of Strife. So their unique rules are the Spectacle of Murder, which basically allows them to fight first in combat, and they can also get a +1 to the charge rolls as well. So this is particularly brutal when they're fighting first, especially on witches, because the sheer amount of attacks they got per model. A full 20 witch unit with the stock loadout and none of the buffs from the combat drugs will have 81 attacks in combat, all at -1 AP. Now it is only strength 3, but if they're nearby a succubus, it's going to be a +1 to wound. Oh, and they can also fight twice with their unique stratagem, which is no method of death beyond our grasp, and it's 2 command points, which just simply allows Cult of the Strife witches to fight again. So things don't tend to last long around these witches, and that's even without upgrading any of the weaponry. Then the Homunculus Coven is the final sub-faction. Everything in this sub-faction has a 5+ feel no pain save, which is pretty good. They're quite a warped bunch. Now the leader is the Homunculus. He not only grants core units an extra point in toughness within 6 inches, but also monsters and grotesque can be healed D3 wounds per turn, a bit like a Technomancer can do with his rites of reanimation. He's also got the ability to come back to life on a 2+ if he's upgraded to a Master Homunculus, so a better version of our Resurrection Protocol stratagem there. That same upgraded model can be given a relic which potentially can turn off your auras for a turn, so be aware if you're planning on using things like the Implacable Conqueror Wall of Trait Aura, for those reroll charges as an example. It could be turned off along with any other auras you're using. In this coven you'll probably see plenty of racks holding liquefier weapons that are auto hitting range attacks at 12-inch range with -2 AP. Grotesque can also take these too. Now I've seen a lot of different covens used, but a fair amount of players use the custom covens here, and one of the two selections they like to take is the Dark Technomancers, which has got the all-consuming ability, and long story short it effectively turns their weapons into plasma weapons because +1 to the wound roll, +1 to the damage roll, but they will suffer mortal wounds if they roll a 1. But thankfully they can't actually re-roll this, which is a good thing at least. Okay, so we're getting there. So you predominantly see Drukhari players making use of multiple patrol detachments due to another unique rule they have, which is raiding forces. So every detachment in your army that is a Drukhari patrol detachment will have a command point cost of 0 command points. And each sub-faction is still going to get their obsession ability. So they're going to be saving a fair amount of CP and creating a very easy to build patrol detachment over and over. Now this unfortunately means they can mix and match these cocktail lists and blend all 3 types in a Drukhari single list. Now this is known as the Real Space Raid detachment. Again, it's quite similar to the Dark Angel supplement, except they're slightly restricted with the small tax. They need to take a unit of each troop type from the 3 sub-factions and a HQ from the 3 sub-factions as well dedicated to those sub-factions, but they're all pretty cheap and they were likely going to be used anyway. Now this is ultimately why Drukhari are currently doing very well in tournament level. So a lot of players seem to also take Drazar, who is a named character who can fit into any other sub-factions as he's got the Blaze for Hire keyword. But thankfully for us, he's a bit of a struggle to fit into these Real Space Raid detachments due to the Drukhari player needing all 3 of those sub-faction HQs in a single list as well as the troops. But they sometimes bring him in a separate auxiliary detachment just so they can still kick our asses. In a given fight phase, he can fight twice, and that includes our own turn as well as theirs. He does have an ability to fight first, but he does need to beat our leadership with 2 dice, and Necrons thankfully always have a leadership value of a 10. However, watch out because Drukhari vehicles can lower your leadership down by 2 if they're within 3 inches. This is with the Grizzly Trophies ability that the vehicles can take. Now his Warlord trait gives him rerolls to hit and to wound in melee, and with 5 attacks base that can be made into 7 if he's using a different profile. It's going to be really nasty. He's also a -1 to all damage, a bit like Death Guard really, and he's got a 4+ invulnerable save, and then finally on top of that he buffs Incubi units around him, which includes himself, so he's got that keyword which is a +1 to the wound rolls. So this makes his average looking strength 5 and strength 6 profile much more deadlier, as they're likely going to be wounded on 2s against a lot of stuff. It's only our transports that can take that kind of hit, but I did mention you can fight twice, right? So let's make an attempt to try and counter all of this. It's not that simple, is it? So there's just so many options that they can have, and we've barely touched the surface really. The one thing that we do have on our side is we pretty much know what kind of units we'll be facing, because the Drukhari Codex doesn't have hundreds of different units like with Space Marines. They usually go with the 3 patrol detachments, so once they've brought at least 1 HQ from each sub-faction and a troop choice from each, they've already spent quite a lot of points. It's 6 points for the Archon, 80 for the Homunculus, 60 for the Succubus, and then for the troops it's going to be 40 for a minimum unit of Cabal Warriors, 40 for a min unit of Racks, and 50 for a min unit of Witches. So at a minimum cost it's going to be 335 points. Now these units are almost always selected each time, and I've done that to a minimum, so you'll find multiples of these troop options, often more than 5 models per unit. Then you got to add all the transports in with the Venoms and the Raiders and whatnot, which they're definitely going to be taken because that's their strong point. And if you don't know about them by now, they're open top, toughness 6, a 4+ armor save. Now we'll mention their weaponry here, which a lot of them take the Dark Lances, which is a very solid weapon option on the transports. So these are 36-inch range, heavy 1, strength 8, -4 AP, and the damage is D3+3. I know, right? Necrons are the only ones that don't seem to get the D3+3 nowadays. So the rest of the standard Drukhari force will be filled out with either Incubi, Grotesque, Mandrakes, Hellions, and then they're going to add some sort of heavy support. But generally they hit hard with their transports and their troops. So let's try to counter that. AP generally doesn't make too much of a difference against Drukhari, as models either have an invuln save or they've got a pretty poor armor save of a 6+, which tends to not matter anyway because of the powers from pain table, because they get that 6+ invulnerable save from turn 1. Now the Cabal do have a 4+, but they aren't really in your face, so you can slightly plan around them because you've got some breathing room. So don't bother with anything you've got to pay points for just to get the extra AP and strength up. Really what you want is numbers. Now if I'm looking at our troops, I'd be looking straight at the Warriors for this. I'm not saying this is the most solid answer to the threat, but it's a better option than our Immortals. The toughness 5 won't really matter against poison weapons or against a buttload of attacks from the Witches, and they will be swept off the board pretty fast if they're left unattended. So warriors, warriors, and more warriors. And I know I say it a lot this series, but you've got to screen them with Scarabs, and lots of those too. Set them in front of your warriors, but don't leave any gap for the transports to fly in, So when you're talking about a warrior heavy list, you've got to think about what is the best way to make the most out of them. So there's tons of tools in our codex. You've got the Technomancers with the Rites of Reanimation buff. You've got the Ghost Darts with the Repair Barge. You've got Resurrection Orbs and the Orb of Eternity with our Nobles and Locust Lords. You've got Canoptic Reanimators. That's just ways of getting warriors back. Then there's Chronomancers with the Invuln saves, Overlords with the My Will Be Done buffs, and the Lords with the Lord's Will, of course. So if you're using these combinations, then we probably should start to think about the best dynasty we could use to field all of this. So from the 6 main dynasties, they're okay, but none really draw my eye when it comes to dealing with Drukhari, especially when you're warrior heavy. I mean, the Mephric code does give you a bit of range and a bit of AP, but the AP, as mentioned, isn't quite needed. The Sautek code, being the other shooty code, also brings a bit of range from the Flayers, which would be the better option here because the troops you face are only toughness 3, so the range is more important than the added strength and AP, so I'd definitely not go with the Gorse Reapers. The Zarakan Dynasty A is more of an elite shooty Necron list, and I don't think that's the way to go here. Your elite models are just going to get swamped by the amount of troop options that the Drukhari have. So really I think we've got to go custom here. Now Pitiless Hunters is a good option for the best range with the Flayers, or Removable Phalanx for a better armor save when remaining stationary. Then maybe Healthy Paranoia for the added range could be also used. Other units that you can add to the mix for the shooty type of list could be something I rarely speak about, which is the Annihilation Barge. With the Twin Tesla Destructor and the Tesla Cannon, the combined damage output is about 9 models on average per shooting phase, and it's also pretty tanky to add a little bit of resiliency with the quantum shielding, and of course it's quick as well. I'd also consider a blend of different heavy locust destroyers that we could use, having a unit to carry the Gorse Destructors to pop open those transports, then a separate unit with the generally worst weapon, which is the Emetic Exterminator, and this weapon is going to remove an average 4 troop models per turn. Finally, for the shooty stuff, the Hexmark Destroyer, another one I generally don't really like in the game, but it could be huge at this game. He can peel off 5 models, and that's before he even gets to reload his pistols for his multi-threat eliminator, which in this case on average is another 5 more shots and likely another 4 more models dead, totaling around 9, maybe even 10 models removed from the board because he's hitting on 2s, and he can do it in Overwatch too. And he can also be protected by being in Deep Strike reserves, so he can come in when those transports have been popped. He's also a character as well, so you can actually protect him with the Lookout Sir buff. Now if you do prefer a melee approach, you've got Rad Reef. That could be something from the custom codes by putting toughnesses down to toughness 2, meaning that you can get Scarabs to move into the enemy units and wounded on 3s, which could be buffed with a Technomancer to hit on 3s with a control node, which syncs very nicely with Warriors to bring those guys back too. Another one is the Flayed ones. They can be wounded on 2s with their Flare Claws with that Rad Reeves as well. They're obviously not as quick, which is a little bit of an issue unless you're using the Deep Strike. And don't forget that fight against stratagem. Now if you go with a Lich Guard, always take the sword and shield. If you really need strength 7, you can always use the stratagem to bump their strength up, which will work a little bit better against the transports. So that stratagem is a disruption field. It's only 1 command point, just gives you an extra strength on a core unit. And going back to those Scarabs, I'd highly recommend taking Spiders with the Scarabs, so then you can be using the self-destruction stratagem for 1 command point to be blowing up a Scarab every turn, causing D3 mortal wounds, potentially 3 mortal wounds, and then that Spider unit can be bringing that Scarab back every turn. Now the ones that I would avoid is the Scorpion Destroyers and the Ophidian Destroyers for this game. They're taxed due to the high AP and the high strength weaponry, which aren't really needed in this game. Now Canoptic Wraiths, they should be using the Whip Coils for this game to get 8 attacks per Wraith, or 10 with the Technomancer using a failsafe Overcharge or Arcana, who can also take the Control Node to allow the Wraiths to hit on 3s, or the Cloak to heal the Wraiths D3 wounds per turn. Now with the Cloak he can be keeping up with a 10-inch movement and fly, but unfortunately doesn't gain that movement and fly with the Control Node. Then as for units that we don't really class as shooty or melee, which are the Catan Shards and the Plasmancer, I'll throw him in there as well because he does the mortal wounds with his Living Lightning and the Harbinger of Destruction abilities. But for the Catan Shards, I'd say the Nightbringer is the best one here because you've got the Reaping Sweep profile that grants 12 attacks instead of 6, which is fantastic for removing weak troop options such as witches. And the Catan powers of course can be very handy again for popping open vehicles and removing lightweight models from play. Now the best part of having a Catan Shard is the Necrodermis, which gives the model a 4+ invulnerable save, but more importantly he can only lose 3 wounds in a single given phase. So even if the witches have 1,000,000 attacks, only 3 wounds can go through. And you know what else that works well here is Drukhari don't have a psychic phase, which is usually a weakness for a Catan Shard, because if they lose 3 wounds in a psychic phase and 3 in a shooting phase and 3 in a fight phase, that's when you normally see them die. Now if you wanted to go cheap with a Catan Shard, you go for the Transcendent Catan Shard, but I personally really like the double attacks from the Nightbringer's weapons profile. One final mention of some units before I go, which is the Flyers. They may be worth a look here. Now all those Drukhari troops we mentioned earlier do not have the fly keyword, and in particular those witches will not be taking down a Doom Scythe. Yet the Doom Scythe can be flying around with a Death Ray, popping those raiders each turn and leaving those witches on foot for your warriors to then shoot at, which are of course behind a wall of scarabs. So just an idea there, and don't forget the undersling twin Tesla Destructor as well, just for good measure. This faction in particular has been a real headache as it's not straightforward with the amount of customization that they bring, so I may have only scratched the surface within the video, but I hope it's helped somewhat for your future games. Also put down below if you've got any of your own Necron tricks that you think may work against your Drukhari force. As a community, let's all help each other defeat these space elves. Guys, do me a huge favour subbing below and like the video on your exits. Thank you all for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.